I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Biblical counseling is not simply the Christian alternative to therapy. If you're new here, I'm Tori. I make content across different social media platforms about issues that intersect with the Christian church. And that's basically everything. I'm particularly interested in topics related to psychology and mental health and how those intersect with the Christian church. And so naturally today we are going to talk about biblical counseling. A couple of things I just wanted to touch on before we get into this. I've taken a couple months off from making videos, but I did do a little podcast exclusive episode back in June. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, and the podcast is called Stories Speak. I did an episode on being LGBTQ affirming and how my faith directly informed my sort of switch from being non-affirming to affirming. So if that makes no sense to you and you think there's no possible way I could ever justify that, check out that episode. So let's dive in. First, I want to talk about why I feel like this episode is important. Number one, my educational background and the work I do full time is in the mental health care field. I got my bachelor's in psychology from a Christian college, I might add, and then I went on to get my master's degree in mental health / school counseling. And through doing that, and through doing the work on my social media platforms and talking to different people, it has become incredibly obvious that biblical counseling does so much harm. And one of the reasons for that is because when people hear biblical counseling, they just assume that it is a Christian version of therapy. However, biblical counseling and counseling done by a therapist who is a Christian are not the same things. And I'm going to explain why, but that is one of the biggest things that trips people up. And so they go into biblical counseling thinking, oh, this is just a Christian version of therapy, but it's not. It is something entirely different. I wanted to cover this topic because biblical counseling doesn't work. Not only does it not help people when they go in for a specific issue, but they end up coming out with so much more harm and trauma done to them. And on that note, throughout this video, the AB use word will come up a lot. And in order to avoid the whole censorship thing and getting flagged and all of that, I will instead be using the word harm. So anytime you hear the word harm, just think of that other more significant word. That's the word I mean. And the last reason why I wanted to cover this topic is because there's nothing wrong with therapy as a Christian. As someone who has been trained as a therapist, who has done some clinical work, who has studied the ethical code, I don't know what the issue is, except there's one thing, and we'll get to that later. I think it might be why places like those who do biblical counseling have an issue with therapy, but just we'll leave that as a cliffhanger for now. So, what is biblical counseling exactly if it's not the Christian alternative to therapy? Well, biblical counseling is essentially a way of using the Bible as an intervention to solve life's problems. And that's it. You use the Bible as the intervention. So for today's episode, I will be talking about biblical counseling for the most part through the framework of the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, which is the ACBC. They are the leading provider of certified biblical counselors. There are other programs, which we'll talk about more toward the end, but they tend to be the loudest voice in the room when it comes to biblical counseling. As we're going through this, I will do my best to put up screenshots of the different things that I am talking about, especially once we get into some of the claims they make and their theology and all of that stuff. However, all of this is available on their website, so if you want to check it out for yourself, just Google the ACBC and you can see for yourself what's going on. This is future editing Tori popping in. You'll hear from me a few times. I just wanted to say, anytime I put out content, I am meticulous about making sure I have accurate information and I'm presenting it accurately. So I will be giving receipts and screenshots and those sorts of things where I can. So I think it's helpful to kind of, as we're talking about why biblical counseling and therapy are different, how do you become a biblical counselor as opposed to a therapist? Like I said, there are other programs. There are some that offer college level classes, a lot of those places are not accredited. Some of them are, but a lot of them are not. So it's not like you're getting a degree in biblical counseling necessarily, at least not one that's accredited. But the ACBC sort of has their own curriculum and course. So the first thing you have to do in order to become a biblical counselor through the ACBC is you have to take their fundamentals course. And that is, and I'm going to have to reference my notes a lot because there's a lot of detail. Their fundamentals course covers 30 different topics, and those are things that are topics that are related to biblical counseling, theology, and other issues that might come up in counseling. So you have to take that fundamentals course. You also have to read 1,000 pages from their approved reading list. Now, all of the books on their reading list, it's public, you can go look at it. All of the books are written by Christians for Christians. And I get that because it's biblical counseling. Obviously, they want a lot of Christian perspective in equipping people that they are certifying as biblical counselors. However, even the quality of that Christian material is not very good. Biblical counselors are not mental health professionals, and that is something we just need to understand right out the gate. However, the ACBC acknowledges that they will encounter mental health issues to an extent that they acknowledge that. And so they do include some books about mental health and the brain on this reading list. However, they might as well just not include those books. They are not quality, they are not evidence-based, they are not rooted in the research, and I'm sure end up being more harmful than good, being that they're not rooted in the research. There are also several books by John MacArthur on the list, which, if you don't know why that's a problem, I encourage you to Google John MacArthur and the Roy's Report. He is alleged to have covered up a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of evidence out there that supports that he did do those things. And so there's kind of a question on why you would want materials from someone who was that morally and ethically corrupt educating biblical counselors. And along that same vein, there is a book on the list called The Excellent Wife, which, if you don't know, the author of that book encourages women to stay in harmful marriages, even at the risk of their children and their own lives. And that's something that the ACBC wants biblical counselors to know and read. So you do your fundamentals course, you read your 1,000 pages of approved reading, then you have to observe at least 10 sessions by someone who is already certified as a biblical counselor. After you've done that, you need to answer 44 essay-style questions, which are about a page to a page and a half long. And the purpose of these essay-style questions is so that the ACBC can evaluate your theology. The theology that you believe is very important to the ACBC, and you must align with them. They are very fundamentalist in what they believe, so they hold very strongly to biblical inerrancy, a future view of Revelation. They believe in a complementarian view of marriage, and they also believe that even having gay desires is sinful. And that matters because a lot of people, even if they believe acting on those desires is sinful, they don't necessarily believe the desires themselves or the thoughts themselves is sinful, but the ACBC does. They believe that scripture should be used as the sole intervention, and that being connected to a local institutional church is fundamental to being successful in biblical counseling as a counselee. So after you've done the essay questions, you also need to provide several different evaluations, an evaluation about yourself, an evaluation from your pastor about you, an evaluation about you from your colleague, a letter from your church saying you're in good standing, and if you are a male, you can provide your ordination certificate if you have that. So once you've taken the fundamentals course, you've read your 1,000 pages of reading, you've observed 10 sessions, you've answered your 44 essay-style questions, and all of your evaluations are turned in, you then need to complete at least 50 sessions or 50 hours of sessions with supervision. And that supervision means you need to talk to someone either over the phone or email about your sessions. At least 10 of the sessions need to be with the same person, and at least 5 need to be recorded and reviewed by your supervisor. So that's what you have to do to become a certified biblical counselor through the ACBC. I also want to talk about what you have to do in order to become a licensed therapist. And I'm going to put that up here side by side so you can kind of see. Now, I've already said that biblical counselors are not mental health professionals. However, a lot of people think they are. A lot of people think it's an equivalent replacement for a licensed therapist. And biblical counselors themselves, the ACBC, does not believe in a lot of effective evidence-based therapeutic interventions. So I want to just compare these two so you can see that they are not equal in their mental health training. So I'm going to go over what you have to do in order to become an LPC, which is a licensed professional counselor. Now, these requirements vary by state, so your state might have just like a little bit of difference, but what I'm going to describe is usually the minimum that is required in order to be a licensed professional counselor. Now, there are other credentials you might hear about by people practicing as a therapist. You might see LCSW, which is a licensed clinical social worker. You might see LMFT, which is a licensed marriage and family therapist. You might see an LSW, which is a licensed social worker. All of those things have their own requirements, but it's a pretty high bar in order to get any of those licenses. So to become an LPC, you must hold a master's degree in a relevant field. So something like mental health, counseling. Some places, including the program I went through, school counseling is another one you can use. So that means about 5 to 6 years of schooling, because you have to do your bachelor's, which is usually 4 years, and you usually have to do that in a related field, so something like psychology, social work, something along those lines. And then you have to get into a master's program, which is usually 1.5 to 2 years, sometimes a little bit longer. During your schooling, you have to complete a certain number of supervised clinical hours, so practicing therapy, but being supervised. For mine, I had to do about 700 hours just to graduate, and a good portion of that was recorded and reviewed by my professors or my supervisor at the time. So that's what you have to do in order to get the education piece. If you want to pursue licensure, there are certain classes that you have to make sure you take while you're in school. So for mine, I had to take a diagnosis class to make sure I fit all of the requirements if I would want to go on to get my LPC. So that's just to graduate. If you want to go on to get your license as a licensed professional counselor, you must then pass the NCE, which is the National Counselor Exam. If you pass that, then you are a nationally certified counselor, which I did. I passed the NCE, so I have that NCC credential. You are still not licensed at that point. You then have to accumulate about 3,000 hours of supervised clinical work. Now, you're not necessarily recording these sessions, but you do have to meet with someone regularly, whoever your clinical supervisor is, in order to discuss these cases and make sure that you are handling them appropriately. As I said, those things can vary by state, but that's usually the minimum requirements. So hopefully you can see already that we have a very theological basis for biblical counseling, and then we have a very thorough mental health basis in order to be a therapist. These trainings are not equal. These trainings are not the same. They do not train you to do the same jobs. Now, the ACBC would be like, yeah, those are 2 different jobs and we do it better. But I want to lay that groundwork so that hopefully you can begin to understand why this is so harmful when we're talking about mental health issues. And not just mental health issues. As we get into it, you'll probably see a little bit more of the issues that are going on. But I want to lay it all out there so you can see the differences in the education and training that these 2 jobs hold. We've talked about what you have to do to become a certified biblical counselor through the ACBC. I also want to touch on some things they say can disqualify you from being certified. So even if you do all the things they say, you still have to fit a certain criteria in order to be certified. You cannot be incarcerated or be on an SO registry and become a biblical counselor, which I was happy to hear. Obviously, if you disagree with the ACBC theology, that can put you in jeopardy of not becoming a certified biblical counselor through the ACBC. If you are part of a church where the pastor is a female, the ACBC will deny you your certification as a biblical counselor. If you hold an LPC, the thing I just described, if you hold an LPC, that could disqualify you from being a certified biblical counselor. Why? Great question. Don't have an answer for you. Now you can read for yourself their explanation here. And when they talk about the fact that LPCs have to follow a certain ethical code and that can conflict with biblical counseling, I have a hard time understanding what they mean. I took an entire class on the ethical code. I don't know what they're talking about. Unless, and this is what I was referencing earlier, unless they have an issue with the fact that as an LPC, you cannot force your beliefs on another person. I'm pretty sure that's the thing they have an issue with. Because as a biblical counselor, you are holding people accountable to a certain brand of theology. Things like, if they're having marital problems and they're not functioning in that fundamentalist complementarian way, you as a biblical counselor are supposed to guide them to do that. Because Scripture is the intervention. And so if you're using Scripture as a weapon against this person to get them to be complementarian, you are going to believe that's going to fix their marriage. If they would just agree with this theology and practice this theology, they would, of course, say Scripture, but it is their theological interpretation of the Scripture. If you would do that, then this would solve your marriage. Or at least you would be in right standing with God. And so even if your marriage is falling apart, even if, say, your husband is still being mean to you, is harming you, at least you know that you're in right standing with God. So yeah, ethically speaking, from the standpoint of an LPC, you cannot do that and be following the ethical code. So maybe that's their holdup with the whole LPC thing. And lastly, another thing that could disqualify you from being a certified biblical counselor through the ACBC is if you are a military chaplain. Now, military chaplains have their own set of ethics or procedures surrounding confidentiality, and that's what the ACBC says is the issue. But it's their explanation of the issue that is really alarming to me. So they say that these issues with confidentiality have to do with, and quote, in situations including but not limited to the confronting of sin. Sit with that for a second. Why should that be an issue? Why is confidentiality an issue when we're talking about confronting sin? And it's, of course, if you have been in a church position that has gone sideways, you've probably seen this happen. It is not about the military chaplain being able to confront that person's sin. It is so that person can go to someone else in the church or in the biblical counseling staff and break confidentiality so that others can go confront this person's sin. And this is not some made-up scenario. This is something that happens quite frequently, especially for people that work in churches. If there is an issue and that person confides in someone or is having biblical counseling from someone, that person can then use that information to go to the other church staff to confront this person's sin problem. And usually it's in an effort to get that person fired or get them to conform to some sort of theology or duties in the church. I don't know how that lands with you, but that's pretty alarming to me. So I want to circle back to this whole mental illness thing because they do have a statement about mental illness on their website, and this is where things get a little fiery for me. So the ACBC says that it is important to monitor signs of mental illness. However, they give no guidance on what that looks like or the procedures in place. And maybe that's in their courses. I don't know. I know from the books that they have on their approved reading list, I'm not confident that they are making people competent in that area in order to know when to refer out. They say some things like there are physical problems while other things are spiritual problems, which just sounds like a cop-out to say that, oh, that person's anxiety is a spiritual problem. That's not a physical problem, it's a spiritual problem. Because we know this happens. We know that there's this belief in a lot of Christian culture that anxiety is at least in part due to a spiritual problem. Depression is at least in part due to a spiritual problem. And whatever, you can have that belief, but when you treat those things in a spiritual way, 99.9% of the time, nothing happens except more harm. So there's that. But their incompetence in this area is so incredibly obvious. And we need to talk about it for a second. So they criticize the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is what we use to diagnose mental disorders in the United States. It lists all of the diagnostic codes so that insurance can be billed, which is very important. In order for therapy to be covered, you have to bill, covered by insurance, you have to bill a certain diagnostic code. And so that's very important for our field and having accessibility to therapy. But they criticize the DSM because the DSM does not detail spiritual causes and spiritual treatment recommendations. So, this is the DSM. I have it. It's huge. It's like 900 pages. It goes through all different kinds of, like, every mental disorder that is officially recognized. So there's anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, eating, I'm not going to say that because that usually gets flagged, substance use, all of that. It's a huge book. Here's the thing. I've read this book. I don't know. It was just a nerdy project that I decided to just read the DSM in case it would ever be helpful information to know. And wouldn't you know it, when I read this on their website, I was like, oh, that's crazy. I've read the DSM. And you know how I know that you didn't read it, ACBC? I know you didn't read it because DSM does not talk about treatment recommendations, period. It does not talk about any treatment recommendations. It is a diagnostic manual. It describes mental disorders. It does not tell you how to treat them. Occasionally, it might talk about things that lead to certain disorders, but all it's doing is describing them so that you can diagnose them. So it's not that they've left out spiritual treatment recommendations. They don't talk about treatment recommendations. That is not the purpose of this book. And we're going to talk about purposes of books here more as we go. But the DSM, it does not do that. It does not aim to do that. It is not leaving anything spiritual out. That is not its goal. And the whole spiritual cause thing, I don't even know what that means. Like, someone has sin in their life or they don't read the Bible enough. Like, what does that even mean? Also, I don't think you would actually want to see the research on those things because it probably wouldn't show you what you want to see. Anyway, and those are the moments where I'm like, come on. Like, you're making claims about this when you haven't even read it. You don't know what it says. You don't know the purpose of it. And you're criticizing it. Okay. Here's the thing though. When we're going to talk about using books appropriately, using books what they're meant to be used for, let's talk about this one. So they believe that the Bible is sufficient for solving all of life's problems. And you're right. The DSM does not give treatment recommendations. It doesn't. Neither does this. Neither does the Bible. The Bible does not tell you how to treat OCD. It does not tell you how to treat ADHD. And it does not tell you how to treat generalized anxiety disorder. In that verse in Peter, whatever, it's not talking about an anxiety disorder. The ACBC claims the Bible is sufficient for solving all of life's problems. The Bible does not. The Bible never claims that about itself. And anytime it is referring to the Word of God and the Word of God being the way, it is talking about the way of God. And if you're confused at what that means, just look at the life Jesus lived. Jesus was the Word of God incarnate. Jesus showed the way of God. That wasn't to solve all of life's problems. It was to show you how to be a decent human being. So unsurprisingly, the ACBC also has issues with a lot of other therapeutic interventions. And years ago when I first did my initial deep dive into the ACBC, I didn't catch everything, and I don't know that they necessarily were specific about the issues they have with therapy. They often said things like it's secular and kind of like were very vague about it. And this time I actually found some of their more specific claims, which is that they are against cognitive behavioral therapy, and they are also against exposure therapy and EMDR. We'll talk about EMDR later. So you can, if you're watching the video, you can pause to read this. Some of the things they mention here I will touch on later, but I'm trying to stay on topic. So talking about CBT, they say that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is an unbiblical substitute for the biblical method of heart change through salvation and sanctification, which produces changed thinking and glorifies God rather than man. I don't know how CBT is supposedly glorifying man. That seems like the undertone of this. And here's the thing. I am not the biggest fan of CBT. That is totally fair. But like, if you're going to criticize it, then criticize it for real. My issue with CBT is CBT can be very, very effective for different things, and it definitely has its place. However, I tend to take more of a trauma framework, and so CBT has very little space in that, but it can be very helpful for treating different things. And here's CBT in a nutshell is just changing your thinking patterns. So when you're thinking a certain way, especially if you're thinking in cognitive distortion, so maybe you are catastrophizing, you're making a mountain out of a molehill kind of thing, CBT helps you learn to not do that. And it helps you rewire your brain in order to think in less distressing frameworks, and so you can see things in a little bit more perspective and not get so overwhelmed initially. And I don't know why they have such an issue with this, because aren't we supposed to like take every thought captive? Like that is literally what CBT is doing. So whatever. And so instead they want you to use the Bible and take every heart captive, or not take every heart. Did I say every heart? I meant every thought. I'm pretty sure I said thought. But yeah, instead they want you to use the Bible, the biblical method of heart change through salvation and sanctification, which like, isn't that the same thing? Like if we're just gonna get saved and then take every thought captive, aren't we still doing the same thing? CBT just gives you the hard tools to do that. The Bible does not. The Bible does not. Guess what? The DSM does not either, but CBT does. CBT does teach you those skills. Goodness gracious. So there's CBT. The other thing that just, oh my goodness. They say this about exposure therapy. So exposure therapy is often used for people who have OCD, and it is a very effective treatment for OCD. It doesn't work for everybody 100% of the time, but it is very, very effective. It is like the top way to treat OCD. And it's, what happens is it's a process of exposing people to the thing that causes them distress in small doses, like very, very small doses, in order to get them desensitized to that and to sit with the anxiety and learn how to cope with the anxiety in those moments, so that they can kind of step up and do bigger exposures until eventually their brain stops responding in that fight or flight way. And so it's very, very effective. It works very quickly if it's going to work. But this is what they say about exposure therapy. They say exposure therapy violates God's heart for sufferers. He does not expose his children to unnecessary suffering, and in fact meets them in their distress and promises to strengthen and deliver them from it. It is in the Lord that hope is found, irrespective of the situation. And this is something else to read this. Like, we have something that is evidence-based. We know something that works. And yes, it's going to hurt for a time, but then you get better and you don't have to experience it anymore. And they want to deny that to people. Why? Because he does not expose his children to unnecessarily suffering, which is crazy. Because if a person comes in who is transgender or they're gay, what do they tell that person? You just got to suffer with it. You just got to deal with it, because that's not God's design. So sorry, you're just going to have to suffer your whole life. Really? Really? What about the woman who is being harmed by her husband? What is she told? She's not told that God doesn't want his children exposed to unnecessary suffering. No. She's told to stay with him. She's told to continue putting herself and her children in harm's way. They are grasping at straws and contradicting themselves because they want so badly to discredit the psychology field and the psychiatry field. You know what this sounds like to me? This sounds a whole lot like Scientology. Okay, moving on. You still with me? So here's another thing that I want to point out that makes a lot of Christians uncomfortable. And if I didn't say this, I probably haven't said this already. I'm a Christian. So this matters to me. It matters to me how we handle Christianity, how we treat people in the name of Jesus. And also, as a mental health professional, I have a little bit more knowledge and background than maybe the average person does in this field. And I think it's important to talk about why this is harmful, because I'm not in favor of harming people. I don't know about you, I'm not. The ACBC says they have a do no harm approach, but as we've seen. So I want to talk about this concept of how they talk about the Bible solving every problem in life, how being part of a local church is part of wellness, and all of these things. And I'm going to say something that's probably going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, and that's okay. We can sit with the discomfort of truth, and that's okay. Like, it can't hurt us. We'll be okay. We can sit there and listen and absorb it, and it's going to be okay. In the field of psychology and sociology, we have done a lot of research on the effects of religiosity and spirituality. And there's even just saying that, there's a lot of different nuanced things that have been studied, things like spirituality versus religiosity, and how are those things different? Do they have different effects? All of that stuff. Christians often like to pull from that research and say, hey, look, when you go to church, when you have high level of spirituality or religiosity, you have better outcomes. You're healthier, you're more happy socially, you have a high satisfaction with life, all of these things. And all of those things are true. However, when we are talking about religiosity and how overall that has positive outcomes, that is not only true for Christianity. We just take religiosity, spirituality, we dump it in a pile. Doesn't matter if it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, like all of it. Just dump it all in a pile. Oh yeah, if you have a high level of religiosity, you tend to have better outcomes than those who have a low level of religiosity. But that doesn't mean that it's all Christian, because it's not. And I say that to say that, number one, not all Christianity is equal. Just because you have a high level of religiosity does not mean that you as an individual will have those better outcomes. When we're talking about these studies, we're talking about generalizations. You have a high level of religiosity. That usually means you are part of some sort of faith community. That means that you probably do things for other people. That means you probably have a good social connection. You have a lot of people supporting you. You have a lot of people who are there if things get hard. You have a lot of people there to celebrate the good things. You can have all of those things and have really good outcomes outside of religion. Religion just provides an easy framework to get connected. We can look at a group of highly religious people and see the outcomes and say, oh yeah, those two things are related. That does not mean each individual person will have good outcomes. So there's that. And then number two, when we look at the research on certain pieces of Christian theology, including certain pieces of Christian theology that the ACBC supports, we have pretty good evidence that shows that there are harmful outcomes to believing those types of theology. Things related to complementarianism, things related to being non-affirming of LGBTQ people. We have that research. And of course, the ACBC will come in and people like them and say that, oh, well, that's secular research. Of course, they found that. They manipulated the data, whatever. But it's funny because some of it's done by Christians. I don't know if any of you have heard of Bare Marriage. They have done quite a bit of research on the complementarian view and different pieces of complementarianism that have been highly, highly correlated with harmful outcomes. And these are Christians who very much care about Jesus, very much care about people. And again, they can just say that that's manipulated data and whatever. I know from my life, myself, people in my life, I have seen the harm these things have caused. So, not only do we need to take the Bible seriously, we need to be responsible with how we use it. The ACBC and I can agree that a lot of people are struggling in a lot of different ways. I want to use interventions and strategies that are evidence-based and promote holistic healing. And while the ACBC claims that they want to do no harm, the theology they believe, we have data that hurts people. And not only does it hurt people, but sometimes it leads to death. It leads to people not wanting to be alive anymore because they think that is better than living as who they are. And it also leads to death in that it does not protect people who are in harmful situations. And those things can escalate to the point where someone is no longer alive because they were not protected. That fruit is rotten. Jesus said, I say it all the time, a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And if the fruit of biblical counseling is this rotten, why are they still doing it? How can you use the word counseling, use it to harm people, and think that that's okay, and think that is the God-honoring, God's way of doing something? Future Tori here. So I cover so much information here, but there's something else that I wanted to at least read and put out there. It could be an entire podcast / video in itself, but I wanted to at least read it so that the information is out there, there's more attention on it, because honestly, I find it to be something that's very concerning. This is the ACBC's Statement on Authority and Power, and I'm going to read it just in case you are listening and you don't have the video in front of you. One thing to note is they use that AB use word a lot, so I am going to replace that with harm so that hopefully the filtering and censorship doesn't get me here. They say that we deny that authority, whether in the family, church, or society, is inherently harmful and unjust. We deny that the source of individual instances of harm is systemic, and harm can only be addressed through dismantling the institutions in which imbalances of power exist. We deny that institutional reforms should be prioritized over individual change. We deny that seeking clarification from those who report such harm dismisses the legitimacy of the disclosure. And we deny that Scripture is inadequate for confronting harm and secular wisdom is necessary to identify the causes of harm. I don't know exactly what they're trying to reference here, but all that comes to mind when I think of this is how so many of us, and several big names in the Christian culture, conversation, whatever you want to say, we have been pretty vocal about how imbalances of power and structures of authority directly contribute to and fuel harmful environments. And while individuals absolutely need to be held accountable, we will continue to see this cycle until we dismantle those institutions and rebuild them. We absolutely need to hold the individuals accountable, but the fact that they have this statement out there that basically is saying that confronting the institutions and frameworks that fueled that harm to happen isn't important to them, that's just so concerning to me. Okay, I have a couple more things that I want to talk about on this topic before we wrap up. And the first one is my favorite topic, which is trauma. There is little to no talk about trauma on the ACBC website. And to be fair, we hardly ever talked about trauma in my graduate program or in my undergrad program, to be honest. I have done a lot of work on my own to become trauma informed, to read everything I can about trauma, about neuroscience, about trauma's impact on the brain. It is a gap in both fields, but at least in my field, it is a self-aware gap, and it is something that's already getting better. I talked to several people recently who are in graduate programs that are centered on trauma, and that is incredible. I love that. So we're already getting better in that. The ACBC, though, continues to downplay the role of trauma and seems to not think it's very important at all. So if you were watching on video earlier, you saw that I put up this quote that I'll put up again from their website. This is actually on their page about harm. So this just adds way more just terribleness to this whole thing. So they have this phrase on here about ACEs, which if you don't know, ACEs refers to the Adverse Childhood Experiences data set. There has been a ton of research into it, and essentially it shows that the greater the number of adverse childhood experiences that you have is directly correlated with the development of certain diseases and health outcomes, and is very predictive of a lot of different negative experiences. And they're able to control for environmental factors and genetic factors and those sorts of things. So it's like, even if you take all of those influences out, like the genetic factors, the environmental factors, if you take those out of the equation, the trauma itself, the adverse childhood experiences themselves still still increase the likelihood of developing certain things like cancers, heart issues, all of that. It is very interesting and also very sad, especially when the ACBC here says that adverse childhood experiences is an unnecessary and unbiblical tool to identify harm. I don't know why they don't they don't elaborate on that. Yeah, they say nothing about why this is unbiblical. So that's a wild thing to say, especially when it has been such an incredibly helpful set of information to have in the field, and for us to continue figuring out how to reduce those effects of ACEs. There's a book called The Deepest Well. It's about a pediatrician who became aware of ACEs and started using them in her pediatric practice as a way to intervene and try to reduce some of those negative effects. And it's amazing and so hopeful, and I definitely encourage you to read it if you're interested. So again, we know these things work. We know these things have real outcomes. Why is that unbiblical? I don't understand. Also, the ACEs is not meant to identify harm. They're using that A word, which I can't say. But that's not, the ACEs wasn't meant to identify harm. It was meant to identify adverse childhood experiences. So it's things like, did you have a parent who was incarcerated? Did you have a parent who was mentally ill? Did you, like, there's this whole list. You can Google it. It's out there for free. It has since been amended, so there's different things that have been added to it and things that are recognized as ACEs now. I don't, like, it's so frustrating because they're, not only are they misrepresenting what ACEs is meant to do in the first place, but then they're just calling it unbiblical. And it's, like, no explanation on why. So again, like, downplaying the role of trauma, which is just wild. They also have this list of materials and different resources. I don't remember if this was specifically about trauma, if this list was specifically related to trauma. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. But this podcast is talking about trauma. And the person on the podcast is talking about trauma in the sense of what us in the mental health field would call big T trauma. So big T trauma are those things that, if I say trauma, they're the things you think about. They're like harm, being in a car accident, potentially being part of a some sort of mass violence, those sorts of things. Those would be considered big T trauma. SA would be another one. And that person agrees that those people need help, but the people experiencing little T trauma, which, like, things like having been yelled at a lot, having been in a very unhealthy relationship, maybe one that was verbally harmful or emotionally harmful. He says that those people have just experienced distress, and we can't call that trauma, and that calling those things trauma takes away from the bigger forms of trauma. I heard someone on a podcast a while back who said that anything your nervous system tells you is trauma is trauma. And I repeat that all the time because I absolutely agree. You do not get to choose what is traumatic. And you can't just snap out of it either. But this idea that calling the smaller things trauma takes away from the bigger things, I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on. And also comes from this framework of thinking where, like, I had it bad, so you can't say you had it bad because I had it worse. And that's self-centered and selfish, I think, but I also think we're thinking about it in completely the wrong way. So I want to give, like, a parallel example of why I think this is a misunderstanding of how to look at trauma. And so I want to talk about Taylor Swift. If you know me, you know that I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan. Future editing, Tori here. So I was editing this video and I talk with my hands a lot, and that made this clip really distracting. So I'm just going to tell you what happened like this. She posed for a picture with someone who worked for a radio station, and as the picture was being taken, he reached up the back of her skirt and grabbed her butt. Details of the case aren't probably relevant. Basically, she reported him to the radio station and all of that. He ended up losing his job. And then he came back and sued her because he lost his job. And so she took him to court. She countersued him for $1 and ended up winning. There were some people who looked at that case and said, how dare she call that SA? Because I've been through this thing that I consider much worse, and that's SA, but that's not. What she went through is not. However, there are a lot of other people, a lot of other survivors of SA who said, no, I am so glad she did that, because if that can be considered SA and we can take someone to court for that and hold them accountable for that, how much more can we hold them accountable if they do these supposed bigger things? And the same thing is true for trauma. If we can acknowledge that these little things cause trauma, how much more can we say that these bigger things cause trauma? It's lowering the threshold. And I've often heard people say that, oh, you might as well say everyone has experienced trauma these days because everything is traumatic. And I'm like, you are so close to getting it. You were like, you're this close. You're almost there. Because yeah, life is incredibly traumatic, and the vast majority of us do not escape it without experiencing some sort of trauma. And some people think that that's like, oh, it's just a fact of life. We have to deal with it. But trauma affects who we are. Trauma affects our relationships. Trauma affects our insecurities, how we handle criticism, how we relate to other people, how we interpret the actions of others. We might think someone intends something, but we only think they intend that because we're insecure about it, or we've been hurt in the past in a certain way. And so when they do this thing, it triggers us. All of that stuff relates to trauma. And the sooner we can recognize that we all deal with trauma and we confront it and heal from it, the literal better place the world would be. The worst thing that you've been through is the worst thing that you've been through. You don't get to compare that to someone else's life and say they had it better or worse, because all you can compare it to is everything you've been through. You cannot fully heal until you acknowledge what you've been through. And the ACBC is saying that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't confront your trauma. You shouldn't acknowledge what you've been through. They are literally preventing people from healing from their trauma. It's hard not to make this entire thing about trauma because I think life is entirely about trauma. But we're going to move on. There's one more thing from this trauma piece I wanted to touch on. So they say the whole thing about how they are against EMDR. They say it's not evidence-based, it's not real, all of this stuff. In short, EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The eye movement part is sort of not as true now, but it's still called EMDR. But it is an intervention where the client experiences some sort of bilateral stimulation, sometimes watching something move side to side, or holding a pod in each hand as they buzz back and forth while they put themselves back in a traumatic memory. This essentially helps keep certain parts of the brain activated at the same time so that that traumatic memory can be processed. Because what's happening with trauma, theoretically, is that the memory does not have, basically it doesn't have a timestamp on it. And so the reason why we experience trauma is because our brain hasn't timestamped that memory, and so it thinks we're still in that moment. And so when we get triggered, that just comes right back up because our brain is like, oh, we're ready, we're in this spot, we can fight. It doesn't matter that this happened 20 years ago. We're ready to fight, we're ready to stay safe this time. And so what EMDR does, it helps the brain identify that that happened a long time ago, or that you're not in that situation anymore. The claim that it is not evidence-based, there's no research to back it, is an outdated claim. There is actually a lot of research for how effective EMDR is for treating trauma. I myself did EMDR for about a year and can confirm it works. It is one of the most bizarre things I've ever been through, but it was so effective for me. And we actually have a lot of evidence that shows that the bilateral stimulation part of it is actually really important. You don't see the same effects if someone is just like just unilateral stimulation, or if they're just partially distracted. It does not have nearly the same effect as the bilateral. So there's something in that. We don't completely understand why yet. We have some ideas, but it is something that is very effective. And so many people who have experienced trauma have found so much freedom in it. But unfortunately, the ACBC has taken this as an opportunity to try to discredit the therapy field so that people will pursue biblical counseling, which again is exactly what Scientology does. So there's that. Okay, are you still here? Are you still here? I can't believe someone would listen to this whole thing. So if you're still here, that's fantastic. We have one more big section that I want to go over, and it is a section, I can't say the word because it's YouTube, but it's harm. It's the ACBC's tab on how to handle harm when that is a factor in a client that you're having that's a counselee for you. When I did my first deep dive on the ACBC several years ago, they did not have this tab. So this is something that is relatively new. And, you know, I want to commend them for taking this seriously. At the same time, while they are claiming to take it seriously and all of this stuff, while also denying trauma and denying so many realities that exist in harm, it's hard to commend them for that, because it's like you're doing all the lip service, but even then, not even all of it. Actually, you're only doing some of it, and it's not good. Like, it's very much not good. Obviously not evidence-based. All of that fun stuff. So their page does have some good advice on how to navigate situations where you find out that someone has been harmed, whether that be a child or an adult. They emphasize mandated reporting laws, which is fantastic because a lot of churches try to handle things in-house, which is illegal, but they continue to do that anyway. And the ACBC acknowledges that their policies and procedures on handling harm will continue to evolve as they learn more. So I would like to point out some of the areas where they could explore further and develop better policies and procedures. Future Tori here again. I just wanted to pop in and clarify something that might be coming up for you, because it's coming up for me as I'm listening to this back in full. Earlier, I mentioned that biblical counselors will often counsel women to stay with their harmful partners at the expense of their safety, at the expense of their children's safety. And now I'm talking about this tab the ACBC has dedicated to harm on their website. And so you might be thinking, Tori, is that really a fair thing to say? I mean, they're emphasizing safety, they're emphasizing protection. Can you really say that they are counseling women to stay with their harmful partners? And yes, I can. Absolutely. I have heard from so many different women who have been counseled in that way by biblical counselors. Not only that, but as you're listening to this and listening to the goals and their methods and all of those things, their goal is not safety. Their goal is not protection. If it was, then they would be listening to evidence-based resources, but they're not. And so I wanted to name that, because I think that maybe you could listen to this and think maybe it's not charitable to say what I said earlier, but that's what happens often in practice. And not only that, but they have The Excellent Wife on their reading list, and that's exactly what that book tells women to do. The first thing that is wild but also not surprising is the fact that they say that emotional and spiritual harm are not real. They say they aren't harming themselves, they are just symptoms of harm. And believe it or not, I actually don't want to make judgments about their motives, but I do find this point conveniently self-protective, because if they conceded that spiritual harm exists, they would have to reckon with just how many people have been spiritually harmed through biblical counseling itself. So there's that. They say that they don't acknowledge spiritual and emotional harm because measuring by the effects of distress is an inconsistent threshold. So they're saying that just because a person has experienced a great amount of distress does not equal to what the person might have done to them. So maybe the person only hurt them a little bit, but they have all this distress. And so they think that they should measure what the person actually did versus the effects of it. They say that labeling the emotional and spiritual symptoms as A rather than the effects of A concedes power to the harmer and dismisses the responsibility for the harmed for their beliefs, thoughts, and emotions before God. So essentially what I get from that is they will not recognize spiritual and emotional harm because it's actually that person's responsibility to not be harmed. They go on to say that a harmer can control the body, the words one hears, resources, and may attempt to deceive through twisting thoughts and beliefs, but he or she cannot control the responses and emotions of the victim. Which to me says that the victim is responsible for their emotions. And so therefore they cannot be harmed emotionally because their emotions are their responsibility. Okay. And of course this is also twisty-turny, and reading this brought me back to being in that world and learning things and just being like, oh wow, that's really a perspective shift that I have to do. No, it's a twisting, and don't even try because it is. Then you'll be here 5-10 years later trying to untwist everything you were taught because you finally see and acknowledge how harmful it is. They say that one important way to remove the harmful or demeaning manipulative control of the harmer over the victim is to restore the victim's freedom and conscience before God. Acknowledging the moral responsibility of the victim before God restores human dignity. That is just so twisted. I can't even, I have a hard time even getting in that frame of mind to understand what they're saying. Which is that a way for the victim to take control over their situation and find freedom is to acknowledge their moral responsibility in the situation. And that will restore their human dignity. Really, because I think it takes away. I think that just continues to strip that person of their dignity by blaming them for the harm they experienced and saying that they have to take accountability for that. So there's also a whole section dedicated to the treatment of the husband's authority during separation. So say a husband has been harming his wife, they separate, and so this section is how biblical counselors should handle the husband's authority over the wife, because if the husband can't be an authority over the wife, who is? Who gets to hold the authority? And I just think it's so weird. I think it's so weird that people actually care about that. And I was going to say I don't want to disparage someone else's beliefs, but if you believe that your husband has authority over you, yeah, I'm not trying to insult you, but that can be a very dangerous situation, and you deserve to be cared for and loved and respected. And if your husband's not doing that, you are not doing anything wrong by finding someone better or just being on your own. And this is the part where I have to think, okay, if you have a wife who is escaping a harmful situation, likely with her children, do you really think that God's top priority is finding a new authority for that wife? At my most fundamentalist, I can't ever imagine caring about such a thing. So they go on to describe that the authority should transfer from the husband to the church, and that the church should care for the wife while they are separated, which, yeah, care for the wife, of course. Transferring her authority to the church is still weird, but okay. And in all of these situations, restoration is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. This section is lengthy, and so I didn't go through it with a fine-tooth comb, but if there were caveats, they were not obvious, because the message was clear. You are not in right standing if you have not been restored as a family under the same roof. They talk about wanting the harmer to show a repentant heart and really mean it, but they fail to acknowledge that if you know anything about harmful dynamics, it's that the people doing the harming are often incredibly charming and convincing, and they are really great at making you think they're good now. They are so manipulative, and that's how they got to the situation in the first place. When they get their power back, they often do something worse. And here they are again in this funny space where they do not want to acknowledge the role of trauma and how trauma can lead people to be harmful people, and they want that person to change and be restored, and yet that person will never fully heal until they acknowledge the trauma that they've been through and how it has led them to be the person they are today. It's like they're like, here, heal, but we're not going to give you any of the tools to do that effectively and fully. And that's not to say every person who's experienced harm is at risk of harming others, but to emphasize the importance of dealing with your stuff. Because although not every person responds that way, some people do. And we all need to deal with the hard things we've been through so that we don't continue to perpetuate harm into other people's lives. Whether that be physically harming them or being controlling or responding in a emotionally reactive way. We all have that responsibility to deal with the effects of trauma. But the ACBC doesn't want you to do that. They just want you to study your Bible and then act right, while completely denying actual evidence-based interventions that have really, really great fruit. They don't want you to use those. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of other providers of some sort of biblical counseling education or credential certification, whatever the case may be. The ACBC is definitely the top one. Some of the other programs are by accredited institutions. A lot of them are not by accredited institutions. And honestly, I could not find a lot of information about a lot of the other providers of biblical counselors. So that's kind of why I focused on the ACBC. They're the most popular, and their materials and what they do are the most accessible. I actually looked at several websites that, there's several schools, several institutions that provide education for biblical counselors, and I couldn't even find a list of values on most of their websites. So yeah, the ACBC got the brunt of this because they are the biggest provider. But they all have the same goal, which is to use the Bible as the intervention to solve someone's problems in life. And to use the Bible that way, I think, is incredibly disrespectful to the Bible. It is incredibly dangerous to do that, and it's just not what the Bible was intended for. I cannot emphasize enough that biblical counseling is not simply the Christian alternative to therapy. They are not the same things. They are not even comparable, which I hope I've made clear in this segment. Biblical counseling is not the same as having a therapist who is a Christian. In that way, the therapist is probably licensed. They should be licensed. Please don't see them unless they're licensed. They are licensed, and so they have to follow an ethical code. There are consequences if they don't follow that ethical code, and they are using evidence-based strategies and interventions from a Christian perspective, which is what a lot of people prefer in the Christian space. Honestly, I don't know that I would even be making this video if biblical counseling was called biblical coaching. If it was called biblical coaching, fine, go for it. I'm not even sure I would ever create any content on it. But it's the fact that they have taken that word, counseling, which is a protected word in many places. You cannot use that word unless you have some sort of qualifier with it, like biblical. Otherwise, you can be sued for practicing without an actual credential, without actually being licensed. It's the fact that they use that word, and then they go and harm people with it. Well-meaning Christians who just want help end up seeking out biblical counseling because they are deceived into thinking that it is actually something that's comparable to therapy, that maybe they're seeing a Christian therapist, when that's not actually what's happening. This probably is not going to mean anything to anyone from the ACBC, but I myself saw a therapist for about a year. It's the therapist with whom I did EMDR. That therapist was not a Christian, and she helped me more than anyone ever has. She used evidence-based interventions. She never forced any kind of belief on me. She worked within my framework of faith and my values, which is exactly what a therapist of any religion is expected to do. Otherwise, they are violating the ethical code, meaning that you can see a therapist who's not a Christian and they should not be telling you to not be a Christian. If they are, you can report them. But when I think about the amount of healing I experienced in that process and the fact that I am a different person for the better today because of that, it breaks my heart that these biblical counselors want to deny people that healing and do it in such a twisted way to say, oh, that's secular, that's not evidence-based, that's this or that. They are lying. And I don't know how you can stand in the name of Christianity and do that to people. So I want to end by giving you a resource. This is not sponsored or anything like that. It is a resource I use all the time. It is called psychologytoday.com. It is a search engine for finding a therapist, and you can filter by insurance, you can filter by wanting to see someone who's a Christian, you can filter by specialization in things like trauma or anxiety or whatever your presenting problem might be. You can also filter by people who offer a sliding scale if you are not able to use insurance for your therapy. There's lots of people in person, but I know that location can be a limiting factor for people, so they also have those who practice virtually. You just want to search, like in that search bar, you just want to search by your state to make sure they are credentialed in that area. I'm a Christian. I care about people. I am a mental health professional. I want nothing more than for people to be healthy and to find healing, and to do that in a way that is effective and is going to bring them the best outcome possible. And I do not see how biblical counseling can provide that. That was a long one. I don't know. I know I've recorded like over an hour of footage, so I'm not sure how long this is going to be. Hopefully I'm able to keep it under an hour, but if you stuck with me this long, thank you. I would love to hear why you did that in the comments, unless you're going to berate me, in which case I will just block you. So yeah, I have no idea what I'm going to do next. I have some ideas. I might want to do a little bit more of a lighthearted one for the next one. I have an idea for one. We'll just see if I can get there. So if there's something, especially in the mental health field and how that intersects with Christianity, that you would like to hear about, I would absolutely do an episode on that. I'm sure I could do a video about the different misconceptions Christians have about the mental health care field, with like medication, therapy, which I touched on a lot today, introspection, even things like the Enneagram and those like self-discovery tools. I could definitely do a video on that. I don't know that that is wanted or needed. I think I end up in these spaces where everybody is pretty well versed in those things, and so then I think they're not needed. And so if those are things that you're like, no, that would be really helpful to have that, let me know and I'll do it. I just want this to be helpful. And as much as it's helpful for me to just like rant about these things and like get it out, I want to create things for other people that are going to be helpful for other people. So let me know what you think, and thanks for sticking with me this long.